I wasn't dead, but I was already being judged, and what I saw in that moment is something I cannot forget, something I cannot keep to myself any longer, because if you could see even a fraction of it, you would never look at your life the same way again. Dear brothers and sisters, listen carefully, because this is not just a story, this is a warning that reaches into the deepest part of your soul. It began on an ordinary evening. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just another drive home after a long day, the kind of moment we all take for granted. The radio playing softly, the road stretching ahead under the dim glow of streetlights. Everything felt normal, predictable, safe, and then in a single instant, everything changed. Time didn't just slow down, it stopped, completely, as if the world itself had been paused by an unseen hand. The sound faded into a heavy silence. A silence so deep it felt like it was pressing against my chest, and suddenly, I was no longer in my car, no longer on that road. I was standing somewhere else, somewhere I could not recognize, a place with no horizon, no sky, no sense of direction, just an overwhelming stillness that felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't darkness like night, it was something heavier, something that seemed to absorb even the idea of light, and in that silence, I became aware of something even more unsettling. I was not alone, not in the way you might think. There were no visible figures, no voices calling out, but there was a presence, undeniable, overwhelming, a presence that saw everything about me, every thought, every choice, every moment I had ever tried to forget. And then, without warning, a light appeared, not blinding, not harsh, but pure, steady, and impossible to ignore. And from that light, he came, Jesus, not as an image from a painting, not as something distant or symbolic, but real, more real than anything I had ever known. And he did not speak at first, he simply looked at me. And in that look, I felt something I cannot fully explain, not just love, not just truth, but a weight, a holy gravity that made every excuse, every justification I had ever made for my life feel empty, meaningless. And in that moment, I understood something terrifying. This was not a dream. This was not imagination. This was a moment of revelation, and deep inside, a question began to rise, one I had never truly asked myself before, not with honesty, not with urgency. Where am I really going? And before I could even form the words, I felt it, a shift beneath me, as if something unseen was beginning to open. And though I had not yet seen what lay beyond, a fear unlike anything I had ever known began to take hold. Not the kind of fear that makes you run, but the kind that makes you realize you cannot escape. And in that silence, standing before him, I knew whatever was about to be revealed was not just meant for me. The moment stretched in a way that did not feel bound to seconds or minutes, as if time itself had lost its meaning. And standing there before him, I felt an awareness growing inside me, a realization that this place was not random, not accidental, but intentional, designed, and deeply purposeful. And then he spoke, not loudly, not with force, but with a calm authority that seemed to echo beyond sound itself. A voice that did not just reach my ears but move through my entire being. And he said, "You are not here because you died. You are here because you must see." And those words settled into me with a weight that I could not ignore, because I knew instinctively that whatever I was about to witness was not only truth, but responsibility. And as he spoke, the space around us began to shift, not violently, but with a quiet unfolding, like a veil being slowly pulled back, and what had once felt like an empty, silent void now revealed layers I had not noticed before, a vast expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, yet at the same time felt confined, almost pressing inward. And I realized something that unsettled me even more. This place was not completely empty. There were traces of something, faint impressions, like echoes of lives, choices, decisions that lingered in the atmosphere itself. And then he turned his gaze slightly, not away from me, but towards something beyond my sight, and I felt compelled to follow. And as I did, I noticed a boundary forming, not a wall, not a physical barrier, but a separation, a line that divided what I stood on from something deeper, something heavier. And I hesitated, because even before I could see what was beyond it, I could feel it, a pull, subtle but undeniable, like gravity, drawing everything downward. And in that moment, a question rose within me, one I could no longer keep silent. Who is this for? Who are we about to see? And the answer did not come immediately. Instead, there was silence again. But this time it was different. It was not empty. It was expectant. And then he spoke once more, and his words carried a clarity that removed every assumption I had ever held. You believe you understand who is lost. You believe you know who belongs to darkness and who belongs to light. But you do not see as I see. And as those words settled into my mind, I felt a quiet unease begin to grow, because I realized that everything I thought I knew about judgment, about good and evil, about who was safe and who was not, might not be as certain as I had believed. And then he said something that made my heart feel heavier than it had ever felt before. You must look carefully, because what you are about to witness will challenge everything you have trusted in. And in that moment, I understood that this was not just a vision meant to show me something distant or abstract. This was personal, deeply personal. And somehow, whatever lay beyond that unseen boundary was connected not only to others, but to me, to my life, to my choices, and to the quiet compromises I had made without ever truly questioning them. And as the space before us continued to open, I felt that pull grow stronger, not forcing me forward, but making it clear that I could not remain where I was. And though I had not yet seen what lay beneath, I knew with certainty that I was being brought closer to a truth I had spent my entire life avoiding. The boundary before us no longer felt distant. It felt immediate, as if every step forward carried a weight that pressed deeper into my awareness. And without realizing it, I had already moved closer, drawn not by force but by something far more unsettling, a quiet inevitability. And as I stood there, I began to notice movement beyond that unseen line. Not clear at first, just faint shapes, like shadows shifting in a place where light did not fully exist. And instinctively, I tried to understand what I was seeing, to categorize it, to make sense of it in a way that would protect me from what it might mean. But before I could form any conclusion, he spoke again, and his voice carried a firmness that left no room for denial. Look closely, do not turn away. And in that moment, something within me resisted, not out of defiance, but out of fear, because I realized that what I was about to see was not something I could unsee. And yet, I obeyed, my attention fixed on the shifting forms before me. And as they became clearer, I felt a confusion rise within me, because they did not appear as I expected. There were no obvious signs, no immediate markers that separated them from what I would have called normal. They were not strangers in the way I had imagined. And then, as if responding to the questions forming in my mind, the space opened just enough for me to see more distinctly. And what I saw unsettled me even further. These were not figures lost in chaos. They were still, aware, conscious, and somehow painfully present. And in that stillness, I sensed something deeper than fear, something heavier, a realization, a knowing that could not be undone. And I turned slightly toward him, searching for an explanation, because everything I had believed about who belonged in such a place was beginning to collapse. And before I could speak, he answered the question I had not yet voiced. You think you would recognize them? You think you would know who they are? And there was a pause, not empty, but filled with meaning. And then he continued, you are wrong. And those words struck something deep inside me, because I realized that my assumptions had been built on comfort, on distance, on the belief that whatever this place represented was reserved for others, for those who had clearly rejected truth, clearly chosen darkness. But as I looked again, something began to emerge that I could not ignore. Something familiar, not in appearance, but in essence, in the quiet way they carried themselves, in the subtle echoes of choices that felt disturbingly close to my own. And a thought formed in my mind, one that I did not want to accept, but could not escape. Who are they really? And when I finally found the courage to ask, my voice felt small, almost fragile in that vast silence. And his response came with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. These are not who you think they are. Those who believed they were safe. And as those words settled into me, a deeper unease took hold, because I began to understand that what I was witnessing was not about distance or difference. It was about something far closer, something that reached into the very foundation of what I had trusted in. And in that moment, standing there on the edge of that unseen divide, I realized that the truth I was being shown was not meant to comfort me. It was meant to awaken me as I continued to look. The space beyond that boundary became clearer, not in the way light reveals details, but in the way truth slowly removes illusion. And what I began to perceive was not chaos, not disorder, but a kind of stillness that carried a weight far greater than noise ever could. It was a stillness filled with awareness, a quiet recognition that something irreversible had taken place, and the figures I saw were no longer distant shapes. They were defined, distinct, each one present in a way that made it impossible to ignore them. And yet there was something deeply unsettling about what surrounded them. It was not chains, not physical restraint, but a heaviness in the very atmosphere, as if the space itself pressed inward, limiting, confining, leaving no room for escape. And I noticed how they existed within it, not struggling in the way I would have expected, but aware, fully conscious of where they were. And that awareness seemed to be the most difficult part to comprehend, because it was not confusion, it was clarity, a clarity that came too late. And as I observed more closely, I began to sense something else, something that moved beneath the surface of that stillness, not a sound, but a feeling. A deep sense of regret, not expressed in words, but present in every aspect of their being. And it spread through that place like a silent echo, and I felt it reaching even toward me, not touching me, but making itself known. And instinctively, I stepped back, not physically, but within myself, because I could not bear the weight of what that feeling represented, and I turned again toward him, searching for something that would make this easier to understand. But his presence did not remove the weight, it revealed it, and he said, "This is not suffering as you imagine it. This is separation." And those words carried a depth I had never truly considered, because I realized that what I was witnessing was not defined by external conditions, but by an absence of something essential, something that once given, could never be replaced. And in that moment, I began to understand that this place was not about what was added, but about what was lost. And as that realization settled into me, I looked again at the figures before me, and I noticed something that made everything even more difficult to accept. They were not unfamiliar, not in the way I had assumed. There was something about them, something in the way they stood, the way they seemed to carry the memory of who they had been, that felt disturbingly close to the world I knew, to the people I had seen, to the life I had lived. And a thought began to form, one that I tried to resist, but could not avoid. They had once believed they were on the right path. They had once trusted in what they thought was enough. And as that thought took shape, a deeper understanding followed. This was not a place reserved for those who had never known truth. This was a place that revealed what happens when truth is known, but not truly lived. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of that realization pressing deeper into my soul, I understood that what I was being shown was not meant to explain something distant. It was meant to confront something within me, something I could no longer ignore. The realization did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, almost gently, as if the truth itself understood how fragile I was in that moment. And as I continued to look at those before me, something shifted, not in them, but in my understanding of them. Because what I began to notice was not just who they were now, but who they had been. Traces of their lives seemed to surface in ways I could not fully explain, not as clear images, but as impressions, moments, fragments of choices that once felt ordinary, and yet now carried a weight I had never considered. And I saw something that unsettled me deeply. They had known what was right. They had heard the truth. They had stood in places of worship, spoken words of belief, gone through the motions that I myself had gone through so many times without question. And as this awareness grew, I felt a tension building inside me, because I could no longer separate myself from what I was witnessing. And I turned toward him again, needing clarity, needing something that would allow me to understand how this could be. And he spoke, not with condemnation, but with a quiet sadness that seemed to carry the weight of countless souls. They knew me, but they did not choose me. And those words struck deeper than anything I had felt so far, because I realized that knowledge alone had not been enough. Familiarity had not been enough. Even belief, in its simplest form, had not been enough. And I began to see the difference between knowing about him and truly surrendering to him. The difference between living a life that appeared faithful and living a life that was transformed from within. And as that understanding settled into me, the figures before me became even more personal because I could recognize patterns, habits, attitudes that felt painfully close to my own life. Moments where I had justified things I knew were not right. Times where I had chosen comfort over conviction, where I had delayed change, thinking there would always be more time. And a question rose within me, one that I could no longer ignore. How many chances had they been given? How many moments had they dismissed? And before I could even finish that thought, the answer came, not as a number, but as a feeling, a sense of wasted opportunity, of time that had been treated as if it were endless. And I understood then that this was not about a single mistake, not about one decision that led them here, but about a pattern, a way of living that slowly distanced them from the truth they believed they possessed. And in that moment, something within me broke, not physically, but spiritually, because I realized that I had been walking dangerously close to the same path, believing that I was safe simply because I identified myself as faithful, simply because I had never fully rejected him. And yet I had never truly surrendered either. And as that realization took hold, the weight of what I was seeing became almost unbearable, not because of what surrounded those souls, but because of what it revealed about me. And in that silence, standing before him, I understood that the greatest deception was not open rejection, but quiet indifference, the kind that feels harmless, the kind that goes unnoticed, until it is too late as that truth settled deeper into my soul. The space before me began to shift once again, not abruptly, but with a quiet inevitability, as if what I had just understood was only the beginning of something even more revealing. And I felt that pull intensify, drawing my awareness closer to the boundary that separated where I stood from what lay beyond. And this time, I could not resist it, because I knew that I was meant to see more, to understand more. And as I moved closer, the division that once felt abstract now became unmistakable. And beneath it, something opened, not with force, but with a silent unveiling, like a curtain being drawn back on a reality that had always been there, hidden just beyond perception. And what I saw was not chaos, not a scene of outward destruction, but something far more unsettling, a depth, an expanse that seemed to extend endlessly downward, yet without distance, a place where presence itself felt heavy, almost immovable. And within it, the figures I had seen before were no longer distant or undefined. They were fully revealed, each one aware, each one conscious of their state. And there was something in their stillness that spoke louder than any cry could have, a realization that could not be undone. And as I stood there, I felt a question rising again, one I could not hold back. Why can they not leave? And his answer came with a clarity that cut through every assumption I had ever held. Because they chose a life without me, and now they remain without me. And those words carried a finality that I had never truly grasped before, because I had always believed that there would be another chance, another moment to change, another opportunity to correct what had been ignored. But here, in this place, I understood that choice had reached its conclusion, not imposed from outside, but formed over time, shaped by decisions that seemed small, insignificant, even harmless in the moment. And yet together, they had created a direction that could not be reversed. And as I looked again, I noticed something that made the weight even heavier. There was no confusion among them, no questioning of why they were there, only a deep awareness of what had been lost, and that awareness seemed to define everything about their existence, not as punishment in the way I had imagined, but as separation, a separation that could be felt in every aspect of that place. And I turned again toward him, my voice barely forming the words, "Could this have been different?" And his response was not immediate, but when it came, it carried a depth that reached into the very core of my being. Every moment of their lives was an invitation. And as those words settled into me, I began to understand something that changed everything. This was not about a single decision made at the end. It was about a pattern of choices made over time, a life that slowly drifted away from truth while still appearing close to it. And in that realization, I felt something within me begin to break open, because I could no longer pretend that this was distant from me. I could no longer separate myself from what I was seeing. And standing there on the edge of that revealed reality, I knew that what I had always assumed about safety, about faith, about where I stood, was now being completely undone. The weight of that truth did not fade, It deepened, pressing into me with a clarity that left no room for escape. And as I stood there on the edge of that unseen depth, something began to happen that I was not prepared for. The distance between myself and what lay beyond seemed to vanish, not physically, but in a way that made it feel as though I was no longer just observing. I was being drawn into understanding it from within, and suddenly, one of the figures turned, not slowly, not dramatically, but with a simple awareness. And in that moment, everything changed, because for the first time, I saw not just a presence, but a face, not clearly in every detail, but enough to recognize something that shook me to my core. There was familiarity there, not because I knew that person by name, but because I recognized the life they had lived, the choices they had made. And in a way I cannot fully explain, I felt their realization, their understanding of what had been lost, and it was not expressed through words. It was deeper than that. It was a knowing that had come too late. And in that silent exchange, something reached me, not as a message spoken aloud, but as a truth that settled directly into my soul. We thought we had time, and those words, though never spoken, echoed with a weight that I could not ignore, because I understood them. I had lived by that same assumption, believing that there would always be another moment, another opportunity to take things seriously, to change, to fully commit. And as that realization unfolded, I felt something shift beneath me, not violently, but with a certainty that made my heart feel as though it was being pulled in two directions at once. And for a brief moment, I felt myself moving closer to that depth, not falling, but being drawn, and a fear unlike anything I had known rose within me, not because of what I saw, but because I recognized how easily I could belong there. And in that moment, I cried out, not with strength, but with desperation, I believed in you. I never rejected you. And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced so far, because I knew that what I had said was true, at least in the way I had always understood it. And yet something about that truth felt incomplete. And then he spoke, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. Belief without surrender is empty. And those words pierced through every layer of comfort I had built around my faith, because I realized that I had relied on belief as a shield, as if acknowledging him was the same as following him, as if knowing truth was the same as living it. And in that moment, every justification I had ever made collapsed under the weight of that single sentence, and I understood something I had never truly faced before, that it was possible to be close in words, close in appearance, and yet distant in reality. And as that truth settled into me, I felt the pull again, stronger now, not forcing me, but revealing just how fragile my position truly was, and standing there, caught between what I had always believed and what I was now seeing. I realized that the line separating those who were safe from those who were not was not where I had thought it was. It was not defined by labels, by habits, or by outward signs. It was defined by something far deeper, something I could no longer ignore. The moment those words settled into me, everything seemed to pause, not in silence, but in a kind of stillness that demanded I finally understand what I had been avoiding my entire life. And I felt something shift again, not around me, but within me, as if the truth I had just heard was beginning to separate what was real from what I had convinced myself was enough, and I could no longer look at that place the same way, because I realized it was not distant. It was not reserved for a different kind of person. It was connected to choices that seemed small, ordinary, even acceptable in the world I had lived in. And I turned toward him again, not with confidence, but with a question that felt heavier than anything I had asked before. What does it mean to truly choose you? And this time, he did not answer immediately. Instead, the space around us began to change once more, not revealing something new, but bringing me back to something familiar. And suddenly, I was no longer standing at the edge of that depth. I was seeing moments from my own life, not as memories I could control, but as truth laid bare. Moments where I had known what was right but chose convenience. Moments where I had silenced conviction because it was uncomfortable. Moments where I had justified attitudes, words, and decisions that slowly shaped who I was becoming. And as each of these moments surfaced, I understood something I had never fully grasped before, that choosing him was not a single decision. It was a continuous surrender, a daily turning away from what separates and a movement toward what restores. And I saw clearly how often I had delayed that surrender, how often I had treated it as something I could return to later, something that could wait. And in that realization, I felt both a deep sorrow and an unexpected sense of clarity, because for the first time, I was not measuring my life by outward signs, but by the direction of my heart. And then he spoke again, and his voice carried both truth and grace in a way that I cannot fully describe. You are still being given time, and those words broke through the weight I had been carrying, not removing the seriousness of what I had seen, but revealing something I had almost forgotten in the midst of it, that what I was witnessing was not only a warning, it was an invitation, and I realized that the line I had been so afraid of was not yet final for me, that I was standing in a moment where change was still possible, where surrender was still within reach. And yet that realization did not bring comfort in the way I expected. It brought urgency, because I understood that time was not something to assume, not something to waste, but something to respond to. And as I stood there, no longer focused on what lay beyond that boundary, but on what was being revealed within me, I knew that the truth I had been shown was not meant to remain in that place. It was meant to follow me back, to confront me in every choice, every decision. Every moment I would be given from that point forward, the weight of those words remained with me as everything around us began to fade, not abruptly, but with a quiet withdrawal, as if the place itself was no longer meant to hold me. And I felt the pull shift, no longer drawing me downward, but lifting me back, away from that boundary, away from that depth. And as it did, I held on to one question, one that had not yet been answered. Why show me this? And when I turned toward him, his presence had not diminished. It was as steady as before, and yet there was something different now, not in him, but in me, because I was no longer standing there as someone observing. I was standing there as someone who had been confronted, and he spoke one final time, not with urgency, not with pressure, but with a clarity that left no space for doubt, because you are still able to choose. And those words settled into me with a weight that was both sobering and undeniable, because I understood that everything I had seen, everything I had felt, had not been to condemn me, but to awaken me, to bring me face to face with a truth that I could no longer ignore. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. The difference between those who remain separated and those who are restored is not found in what they claim, but in what they surrender. And as that understanding took hold, the space around me dissolved completely, and suddenly, I was back. The sound returned, the movement, the world I had known just moments before, but nothing felt the same, because I carried something with me that I could not set aside, a clarity that followed me into every thought, every choice, every quiet moment where I would once have moved without reflection. And I began to see my life differently, not as a series of events, but as a direction, a path formed by decisions that either drew me closer or slowly pulled me away. And I could no longer pretend that there was no consequence to that direction. I could no longer believe that time would always be there waiting for me to respond. And in that realization, something within me shifted, not outwardly, not in a way that others could immediately see, but deeply, where intention is formed and where truth either takes root or is ignored. And I understood that what I had been given was not just a memory. It was a responsibility, a call to live differently, to move beyond the comfort of passive belief into something real, something active, something surrendered. And even now, as I recall what I was